Hello, my name's Kingsley Singleton and welcome to this Photoshop Made Easy video lesson from Digital Photo. In this lesson, we're going to look at maximizing the colors in your digital images using the power of RAW. And this really is the best way to control color in your pictures because it gives you much purer results than you'd get from using a JPEG, which, by its nature, has already been tweaked and processed and compressed by your camera. A RAW file, in contrast, gives you a lot more latitude to make adjustments. So you'll be able to do things like push the saturation a lot harder without fear of the image breaking up and losing detail like it would if you're using a JPEG. Of course, RAW files need to be converted though, and it's in this conversion process that will make all the changes that are going to bring the colors in your images alive. So taking our unprocessed example, this is the shot just as it would have come off the camera, having made no changes to the RAW file, to the one that we've had a bit of a play around with. And you can see that we've ended up with a much more striking image. We've managed to get some really bright punchy blues in the sky and also beefed up those reds in the lighthouse. Now, there are lots of ways to control colour in RAW, from the temperature slider that adjusts the white balance of your images all the way through to the vibrance and saturation sliders, and finally there's the HSL tab that's in the latest versions of Photoshop, where you can control the hue, saturation and luminance of individual colours in your shot. A very powerful tool, as we'll soon see. But let's start with the basics, and we'll close down our example images here, and we'll load in the start image that's on this month's CD. Just come up to File, down to Open, and pick the one called lighthouse.dng. Click Open and that'll appear in Photoshop's RAW converter. Now at this stage it's worth pointing out of course that we're using Photoshop CS3 here, so if you're using Elements you will see a slightly different version of the interface. The main difference is here, and if you're using Elements you'll notice that you've only got 3 of these adjustment tabs. You'll see the Basic one, the Detail tab, and also the Camera Calibration tab. Don't worry though, it's still possible to get some great results from your RAW files using just those basic options. So the first thing that we need to do, as always when we enter the Adobe Camera Raw interface, is just check that we're seeing the RAW file exactly as it came off the camera. So click on the flyout menu here and pick the option called Camera Raw Defaults. And that really just gives us the purest version of the data, without any previous adjustments having been made. So the first thing that I'm going to do before I start looking at the exposure of the image and the colours within it is just crop it slightly, just losing this building here on the left hand side and moving the lighthouse a little bit more sort of over onto the thirds of the shot. So come up to the top here and click on the crop tool, and then you just click and drag that out over the picture. Something sort of around about there should be fine, I think. We'll leave a nice bit of that blue sky that we're going to be exploiting. And then we can just hit return to lose those corner handles. And now we can start having a look at the color temperature and the tint of the image. No matter what version of Photoshop you're using, you'll find these at the top of the Basic tab here. And you can either select your white balance from some presets just by activating this menu, or you can control it more manually by clicking and dragging the temperature slider. In this case, even though it was quite a sunny day, you'll see that our color temperature was set a little bit lower than the normal daylight balance. Mainly because, as you see here now that I've clicked on it, it actually makes the image look a little bit too warm. And it's also clipping out some of the highlights on the lighthouse there, which you can see in red because I've got my highlight clipping warning turned on. You can just turn that on and off up here at the top right of the interface, and the same goes for the shadow clipping warning there as well. So we'll turn both of those off for now, and then just click and drag that temperature slider down to roughly where it was before. And the main reason for this is that the higher we push it, you see, the more that we kind of lose those nice blues in the sky. It makes the rest of the image look fairly kind of warm and cheery, but what we're after is those blues, so we're going to need to keep it fairly low. As I said, something around sort of 4400 should do fine. Any lower than that and things get particularly frosty. So, as I say, around 4500, something like that should be fine. Now the tint slider, below the temperature slider, lets us push the colour in the image either towards magenta at this end or green at the other. So it's only really used for making very minor adjustments, and we can leave that around +5 in this case. Now let's just click our highlight clipping warning back on for a moment, and you can see that there are still some red areas there. So just coming down to the exposure slider, I'm just going to drop that ever so slightly to get rid of a few of them. We can deal with a tiny little bit at the top of the tower there, and then we'll work through the other sliders. Recovery I think we can leave alone. Fill light, that's okay as well. We're just going to bring up the blacks in the image a little bit though. And it's worth just holding down the Alt key as you do this, just to see where those kind of blacks are starting to come in on the image. I'm going to set that at about 30 or so, I think. Just making sure we've got a nice kind of full range of tones within the shot. Brightness can be left at +50 and contrast at +25. Those are the default settings. And that brings us on to the clarity, vibrance and saturation sliders. Now the clarity slider just gives us a little bit more contrast in the mid-tones of the image, so it's worth kind of bumping that one up a little bit. In this case we'll push it up to +40. And if you want to kind of give yourself a better example of what's going on when you're making these adjustments, just click on and off the preview box there, and you can see that we're already having quite a positive effect on the image. So that brings us down to the vibrance and the saturation sliders. And that's where things get really interesting when it comes to colour. Now these two sliders do similar jobs but not the same. The vibrance slider controls the least saturated colours in the image, whereas the saturation slider applies more of a kind of a blanket effect over every colour within the shot. The best way of seeing what they do though is to have a play with them, so let's do that. If I click and drag the vibrance slider, for instance, up to about +60, you can see immediately it's having an excellent effect on the blues in the sky there. It's also making those reds a little bit more cheery too, and again if I click on and off the preview box, you can see that we're getting some much nicer results. It's not overpowering the image though, which is what might happen if you do the same thing with the saturation slider. Let's just set vibrance back to 0 for a moment and do the same with saturation, and generally it just looks a little bit more gaudy really. It's picking up perhaps colours that we don't necessarily want to add more saturation to because they're already quite strong. However, it is having quite a nice effect on those reds in the lighthouse, so what I'm going to do in this case is set the saturation to +20. I'm also going to bring that vibrance up to +50, or maybe actually I'll go for +60 in this case. And there, again, just by clicking on and off that preview button, you can see that we've had a really positive effect on the picture, just by using the basic tab and these sliders that are available in all the more recent versions of Photoshop and Elements. Okay, so if you are using Elements and you don't have access to these other tabs that are available in the full version of Photoshop, give those basic settings a try and you'll see what a positive effect it can have on your pictures. But now we're going to have a look at the more advanced options that are available under the HSL tab. So give that a click and you'll see immediately that we get a whole new range of sliders to work with. The first of them under the Hue tab here at the top, and what these allow us to do is control the hue of individual colours within the image. So taking the blues in the sky as an example, if I click and drag this slider around, you see they change independently of all the other colours in the shot. Now we could push them slightly towards the pinker, more purpley kind of tones there, or we could bring them towards cyan if we liked, but to my mind they're actually fine as they are. So we'll leave that at 0, but we can use any of these colours really. There are lots of kind of reds and oranges down here in the pebbles, and we can kind of push and pull those sliders around to have an effect too. Of course there are these reds on the body of the lighthouse there as well, which we could kind of effect there. You can see we can push them all the way from orange over to kind of more of a purpley colour. So that's a very quick and easy way of affecting individual colours within your picture. Not of a huge amount of use to us here though, because we're quite happy with the colours as they are. What we can control though to have a positive effect is the saturation and the luminance. Starting with saturation and looking primarily at the reds and the blues in the image, we can once again control these individually. So I can push the saturation of those reds up a bit. See, we're getting a real kind of pillar box kind of red now, as opposed to a slightly duller one before. So let's push that one up to about plus 50. And equally the blues, we can increase the saturation of there. Don't want to push it too far, because then we'll start losing detail in the sky. And also you'll notice that there are other blues in parts of the image that aren't the sky. Down here in the pebbles, for instance, we can see some effect from that slider. So we don't want to go too mad with that. We'll just push those up to plus 30. The rest of those saturation sliders we're going to leave alone, and we're going to move on to the luminance tab. So once more we can individually control the colours, making the reds lighter or darker. In this case, I think we're just going to kind of give them a little bit of a push, maybe bringing that up to plus 15. And then coming down to the blues again, what I'm going to do is make the blues in the image darker, so we really get that kind of fantastic azure sort of sky. But once again, if you look at what's going on in the pebbles, we're having an effect there too. We'll deal with that in a moment, but for now let's kind of concentrate on getting that sky right. So I think sort of bringing that down to about minus 50 or minus 60 is having a really nice effect. Right, so I'm really happy with what's going on in the lighthouse and in the sky there. Just clicking on and off that preview button again kind of shows us the difference that we've made just by using the HSL tab this time. That's a pretty outstanding difference to what's available just with the basic tab. But what I'm also going to do before I open this image into Photoshop itself is just click on the lens correction tab, and I'm just going to correct a little bit of vignetting that's going on. So let's just push that over to about plus 30 or 40, just lightening those corners. Something around there should be fine. Okay, so now let's click on Open Image at the bottom of the interface, and that'll load our converted RAW file into Photoshop. Now, as I said before, I'm really happy with the effect that we've had on the lighthouse and on that bright blue sky there. The only thing that is bothering me is the fact that the changes we've made have kind of broken up some of the other areas of the image. We've got a bit of a colour shift in the sea here, and also these pebbles aren't looking quite as good as they did before. So what I'm going to do is first just save this conversion, come up to File, down to Save As, and we'll call this one Lighthouse 1. Save it as a JPEG, click Save. Choose maximum quality there, and then once I've saved the file I can come back to the file menu, down to open, pick our original lighthouse.dng raw file there, open that back up into the Adobe Camera Raw interface. You'll see all the settings that we had before are still in place, but this time I'm just going to click back on that HSL tab, and I'm going to reset those saturation sliders, just because they were breaking up kind of parts of the image there that I didn't want to affect the colours in really. That's looking a lot better. So we'll click back on the basic tab, have a last look around those pebbles just to see that they're kind of appearing as we like. I'm just actually going to drop the vibrance and the saturation sliders a bit, just to kind of throttle back on the colour work in those areas. And what that'll actually do is have an effect of making the sky and the lighthouse kind of all the more prominent in the image. I am just going to warm up that foreground a little bit using the temperature slider now, just bringing that up to about sort of 5200 or so. That's looking quite nice. So now click Open Image, and our second conversion will be loaded into Photoshop. You can see what a sort of a difference there is between the two just by comparing them side to side. And now to blend in that foreground, just select the Move tool in the toolbox, hold down Shift on the keyboard, and then click and drag the second conversion into the first one. Release the mouse button, it'll drop in nicely there. We can close that one down without saving it. Then just come up to the window menu, down to layers. That'll bring your layers palette up on screen there. And what I'm going to do is just delete the parts of this second conversion that I don't want. So come over to the eraser tool. We'll set that up with a nice big soft edge brush. Make sure the opacity is up at 100%, and then having layer 1 selected, within the layers palette there, we just click and erase through that nice sky that we worked up earlier. Now that should work pretty well. But before we finish there, we'll just drop the opacity down to about 30% and give it another quick sweep along, just to kind of blend in those two layers really nicely. Once you've done that, and it's very quick and easy to do, as you can see, just come up to Layer, down to Flatten Image, and there is our perfectly converted RAW file, taking advantage of all those brilliant blues in the sky and those cheery reds in the lighthouse. And also, just using that quick and easy split RAW technique, we haven't kind of busted up any other parts of the image. So give it a try with the example image, that's lighthouse.dng, which is on the CD, but have a go with your own images too, because the results are well worth it. See you next time.